My name's Patrick Terry, and I'm the CEO at the Columbus, Ohio Council on World Affairs. It's a pleasure to welcome you this morning to today's amazing program. Last night, our keynote talked about the old days, the Russia-U.S. geopolitical sparring is long behind us. And our new, shall we say, adversary, collaborator, competitor is China. And so it's apropos that today starts with that topic discussion. In fact, the title is U.S. China Ties, the Geopolitical Test of the 21st Century. And maybe after last night's discussion, we might add the 22nd as well. So I'm excited to introduce three panelists today and a moderator that is distinguished, each among their own field. We're going to start to my far left, to your right, if you just raise your hand, Tom Wright. Tom's the director for the Center on the U.S. and Europe at the Brookings Institution, and just so happens to have a new book out called Aftershocks, Pandemic Politics, and the End of the Old International Order. Tom will be outside with signing books. Thank you, Tom. Next to Tom is Liz Economy. Liz is a distinguished visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution. She also is a senior fellow and director for Asia at the Council on Foreign Relations. She's on the board at Swarthmore College and also has a new book out. I think it's out in the UK now, and it's going to be out in the US in January, titled, wait for it, The World According to China. Short and sweet. She also serves as a senior advisor to the US Secretary of Commerce, but is not speaking today in that capacity. She's speaking in her capacity as a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. And then next to her, we have Bridge Colby. Bridge is the co-founder of the Marathon Initiative, and he also has a book that will be on sale in the back and being signed called The Strategy of Denial, American Defense in an Age of Great Power Conflict. And next to me is Carla Freeman. Carla will be the moderator for today. A brilliant expert who currently is a brilliant expert, and she's literally the senior expert in the China program at the U.S. Institute of Peace. Please join me in thanking and welcoming these distinguished speakers.
Well, good morning. I hope you can hear me. Great. Thank you so much for the introduction, Patrick. And as Patrick said, we have an amazing group of speakers here today to talk about the theme of today's panel, U.S. China Ties, the Geopolitical Test of the Century. I have the pleasure of moderating today, and the way we're going to do it is my favorite approach. We're going to do the whole thing as a Q&A. So I get to start the discussion off this morning by asking a few questions, and then after about 25, 30 minutes, we'll turn over to you for your chance to engage our extraordinary experts this morning. And then when we wrap up at 9:30, again, just to underscore what Patrick told you, there are books outside in the foyer, both Tom's and Bridges, and you can join them and get some copies and get them signed. So without further ado, I'm going to go in the order that Patrick began us on. I'm going to start with Tom and move right in. In your book, Tom, you describe the current and persisting pandemic as the quote unquote most severe crisis since World War II for the world's wealthiest democracies. How did COVID-19, in your view, accelerate the shift that you characterize as a move to a new international order? What do you see as the principal geopolitical and transnational threats involved in this transition? And if you like, what do you see, how do you see the international order? How would you describe the international order that we're moving toward? How much of an order is it?
It's a lot there. Thank you, and it's a great real pleasure and treat to be here. And as Bridge will know, I think just doing Zooms every day on books is exhausting. So
human beings, actually.
Doing something in person is incredible. So, and it's great to be back with you all. So thanks so much for having me today. Look, I think what was interesting, I think as we sort of wrote the book, was that we had this global crisis that affected everybody in unequal ways, but everyone pretty much at the same time in similar ways all around the world. And we had very little international cooperation because it occurred at a time of geopolitical rivalry and many sort of nationalists in power around the world. And when you take a sort of a step back, if you look at where we were 10 years ago, basically we now have near worst case scenarios on transnational threats and a near worst case scenario on great power competition, not a hot war or maybe not even a cold one, but pretty close to that, certainly more severe than people anticipated maybe in 2011. And there's a negative synergy between both of those, right? So the pandemic made great power rivalry worse, and great power rivalry complicated sort of the response. So I think it is a interesting sort of moment in time, and there were lessons to be learned in what we go and do from here. But before maybe we'll get to that later, but just in terms of the China piece of this, I think what really struck us was that the response to the pandemic wasn't meant to be this way, right? If you look back at 2002-03 with SARS, China put in place reforms after SARS that were meant to prevent it from responding in that way again. They strengthened sort of the Chinese CDC to make it more like the U.S. CDC. There was reforms put in place for the rapid transmission of information to central authorities. We had cooperation with the international community, Chinese representation in various WHO missions, a lot of cooperation with the U.S. Embassy in Beijing. And in the book, we talked to a lot of those officials from the embassy about how that sort of unfolded. But when COVID hit, most of those reforms, melted away. And we saw, maybe early on, it was because of sort of local authorities, but when Xi Jinping sort of took over the response, he doubled down on that. And we saw really quite a assertive and secretive and repressive response. And so I think that does tell us something in terms of our prospects for cooperation and engagement with China in the future. Like as we come out of this pandemic, our impulse will be to work together and try to repair some of these forms of cooperation, and we should definitely do that. But I think we do need a backup plan as well for how to prepare if that cooperation doesn't pan out. And that's really the point of the book, is that we have to sort of prepare for these transnational threats with the world that we have, which is basically a broken world at the moment, with the breakdown in cooperation and with great power competition. And we need to think about how we would sort of navigate these challenges. And in the book, we have a few recommendations. Most of them aren't particularly new, but I think one that is a little bit new perhaps is we do call, and this gets to the new sort of part of the order, we call for, in addition to the WHO, in addition to full engagement with the WHO, that the US would set up a global alliance of pandemic preparedness of like-minded countries that would commit to higher levels of transparency, take on more of the burden of providing global public goods on global public health, and agree to higher levels of coordination in a future crisis. So set sort of a higher standard, and we think that that would sort of reinforce those universal institutions.
Well, thank you so much. Many challenges ahead. And that brings us back to China. And a question for you, Liz, many questions for you. But let's focus on one that I think will tie into your forthcoming book, China's ambitions and their role and their impact on the changing world that we're navigating. Ahead of the Biden-Xi meeting, China just wrapped up an important meeting of its own, a political meeting, the 6th plenum, which appears to have set Xi Jinping up to be more than a two-term leader, a break from what had seemed to be a sort of two-term pattern for a sort of 10-year term for China's leadership. It followed China's leaders who had participated in China's revolution. So this seems to set Xi up. It gives him the additional time and moral authority, if you will, even giving him his own special era to do a lot of things. Why has China's Communist Party made this move to enable Xi to sustain his leadership? It suggests that the CCP has has some significant ambitions. What are these? And what, if any, are the internal constraints that may impede these ambitions?
Okay, Carla, thanks. It's great to be here with you and with Bridge and Tom to talk about this really important issue. I do have to offer one quick disclaimer, and that is I actually retired from the Council on Foreign Relations. Patrick, so I just want to be clear, I'm full-time senior fellow at the Hoover Institution and on leave from there to serve as a senior advisor to Secretary Raimondo for China. But my remarks are, as you said, Patrick, my own, and I'm speaking in sort of from the Hoover Institution stance. Okay, having said all of that and eaten up probably 2 minutes of my time for that, look, why is the Communist Party giving Xi Jinping full reign? Because they're, grossly mistaken and, misguided? No, I think, he is a strong leader and he has articulated a strong vision. And I think in many respects, that is what distinguishes him from previous leaders. When he came into power in 2012, I think most of us really didn't know what to expect. And he was kind of this international man of mystery. And you sort of wondered, what's he going to bring to the table? And there were widely disparate views that were expressed by people, analysts here in the US. But I think pretty quickly, maybe within the first 24 hours, he'd given a speech where he had talked about the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation as being his ambition. And I think it relatively quickly sort of unspooled that what this meant was in part a domestic agenda of having a robust Chinese Communist Party at the forefront of the political system, one that had rooted out corruption. It meant having a People's Liberation Army that, as he put it, is capable of fighting and winning wars. It meant a more prosperous China, doubling per capita GDP by 2021. And I think transforming China from a manufacturing nation to an innovation nation. So there was that domestic agenda, but in many respects, that domestic agenda really spoke to, or was, underpinning the true ambition of the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, which was to reclaim Chinese centrality on the global stage. And in that, I think what we've seen over the past almost decade now, because as you suggest, he is now completely positioned for his third term as general secretary, third term as president, third term as chairman of the Central Military Commission. What I think what we've seen over the past decade is really that he's pursued this ambition, I think, across 4 dimensions. And the first is, and I think the most important, is reclaiming what he considers to be Chinese sovereign territory. He says there can be no great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation unless China is unified. And in the first instance, and I know that we've got one of the experts here that's going to talk a lot about this particular issue, so I'll just move quickly through it, but it really means, Taiwan, Hong Kong, the South China Sea, right, core interests. But what we saw during the pandemic was a much more assertive China that also, had border conflict, the first deadly border conflict with India in 40 years. It laid claim to territory within Bhutan and had a lot of sort of military adventurism into the territorial waters and airspace of Indonesia, Malaysia, and Japan. So that ambition we see, he's very explicit about the core issues, but if we look, we can also see what the broader ambition is in terms of the sovereignty claims as well. Pushing out from there, you can kind of think of it as 4 concentric circles, I think. In a second concentric circle, it's really about supplanting the United States as the dominant power in the Asia-Pacific. And I think to date, we mostly see that in his effort to develop new regional institutions like the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. And basically, China's trying to lay claim to being the regional economic leader. It has competition, but mostly from Japan as opposed to the United States, I would say. He's talked about a new Asian security initiative that would just be for Asians. He's fond of saying that Asia is for Asians to govern. And he's tried to sort of limit the US ability to conduct military exercises in the South China Sea by trying to persuade the members of ASEAN to sign a code of conduct that says all ASEAN members must agree for any outside player to hold a military exercise. So ASEAN hasn't agreed to that, but you can see kind of what he's pushing to accomplish. And he certainly calls often for the dissolution of the American alliance system, saying that it's anachronistic and a relic of the Cold War and unfairly targeted at China. I'll move quickly, sorry, Carla. The third is really about, the third concentric circle is really about embedding Chinese interests, political, economic, and security in other countries. And I think it's doing this through the Belt and Road Initiative, and we can certainly talk more about that if people are interested, but I think it's fairly well explicated by now, but just moving from hard infrastructure to digital, the digital Silk Road, there's the health Silk Road, but there's also political capacity building in other countries, training, officials in Tanzania on how to write their cybersecurity laws, how to do like real-time censorship of the internet. So exporting elements of China's model. I think it's really important to understand that. It's a debate in the world in which we live, but I don't know why it's a debate. It should just be resolved because they certainly are, exporting parts of their model. And the security dimension, right? China established its first military logistics base in Djibouti. I think we're going to see one shortly in Cambodia and some other places. And then finally, I'll just tick off, there's also, of course, the coercive element of China's diplomacy, so how it tries to shape the actions and the statements of other countries and actors in other countries, especially around issues related to its sovereignty. But as we've seen with the boycott against Australia, Australia came out and said, we want a real investigation into the origins of COVID-19, and all of a sudden you have this massive boycott of Australian goods. So China's very fond of using the leverage of its economy to try to coerce countries into doing what it wants. And then finally, sort of the last, concentric circle is really China's effort to transform norms and values in global governance institutions so that they align more closely with those of China. This plays out in human rights, in internet governance, even in development finance, and then China's efforts to shape norms in areas like the Arctic, sort of calling itself a near polar power, saying it's going to be a great Arctic power, even though it's like 900 miles away from the Arctic. But it's trying to insert itself, I think, in more ways. So any thought that we had that China would be a system maintainer or a system reformer, I think we're at the point where it really is becoming a system revolutionary.
Well, thank you so much, Liz. And let's move to you, Bridge, on American power amid China's great rejuvenation. Your book starts by talking about the changes in the structure of international power. And you of course, explain how it's more diffused. And to put it in a nutshell, the unipolar era is over. And then help us think through what the United States should do to reorient its strategy in that environment, in this rivalrous world. And you construct a case for what you call a strategy of denial. How is what you lay out different from the way that the United States addressed the Soviet Union and other communist challenges? How is it different from containment?
Sure. Well, thanks, Carla. Thanks to the World Affairs Council. It's really an honor and a pleasure. And I reiterate what Tom said. It's great to see so many living, breathing human beings in the flesh. And it's great to be on with two friends, Liz and Tom. Excellent points and books. Although yours is still to come out, but based on what you're saying, I'm loving it. So,
you did love my previous book.
Exactly, that too. Okay, so allow me to associate myself with what Liz said in particular. Although Tom's, I think, points were also actually really resonate with me as well. But what is a strategy of denial? Well, I think Liz has laid out the ambitions of the Chinese nation, and my book actually looks at China a little bit from the outside and doesn't take so much of actually it sounds like our books are kind of complementary because yours is really a look inside and mine is a look, okay, I don't know what the Chinese leadership is thinking, but we can see how they're behaving and we can look at the structure of international politics, and it's critical in that context that we get our strategy right, particularly that we get our defense strategy right, because to go to your point, Carla, in the so-called unipolar era, the United States was so superior in power over any kind of interest that we might care to fight about that we actually didn't really need to worry about our defense strategy that much. I mean, there were debates about counterinsurgency or so forth, but our military could handle any plausible threats to what we might actually care about. That's no longer true. The range of potential threats that we face is far greater than the actual power we have in the international system. And that's primarily because of the rise of China, although there's also the rise of other nations like India and Southeast Asia and so forth. So in that context, what do we need to do? And particularly, what is our defense strategy, which involves killing and dying potentially in large numbers? We need to be much more rigorous than we have been in the last generation about that. And so this book is an attempt to really grapple with that. It's about China, because China's the most important actor in the international system that we need to account for, but it's fundamentally a book about our defense strategy. And in that context, denial, in my view, has a twofold meaning. So a reasonable defense strategy, if it's to be sound, has to proceed from a reasonable grand strategy. And I'm a Clausewitzian in this sense. Defense and military affairs need to be conscious of their political objective and the political constraints and risks and costs and so forth and interests at stake. So the geopolitical strategy that we need to fundamentally, and I think we need to much more clearly ground our grand strategy as well in a concrete connection to Americans' practical interests. And I think this group actually is a really important vehicle and mechanism for this conversation. I think our geopolitical or grand strategy objectives were sort of hubristic in their conception in the unipolar era and led us to, in a lot of ways, this sorry state. But whatever you thought about them in the past, they're no longer tenable. So what is it that we're trying to do? My view is that we're fundamentally need to be focused on, in addition to obviously the direct security of the American people, is our prosperity and our freedom. And those are obviously linked, because if our economic security if we're not economically secure and reasonably economically autonomous, we won't actually have freedoms. And I can talk about that a little bit more. And the primary danger to those interests is a state becoming so dominant in the international system that it would have the power to intrude on our national life. And I think Liz talked about what's happening in Australia is the danger. Now, Australia is standing up to its great credit, but primarily because the United States is there to help it, implicitly or not. Whether we're doing a good job of helping is another question, but the Australians know that. But that's the world that we need to fear, a world in which there would be a state that was so powerful, that had agglomerated so much wealth and GDP, if you will, that it could intrude itself in our national life and undermine our freedoms. And by far the most realistic and serious prospect of that is China becoming dominant in Asia. Asia is by far the world's most important region. It's going to be about 50% or more of global GDP. Europe is a distant second at 25%. In fact, Joseph Borrell yesterday admitted that in 20 years, Europe will only be 10% of global GDP. So the primary theater is Asia, and by far the most important state, other than the United States itself, in the international system is China, which is an economy roughly of our own size. And that's the first time we've dealt with a rival in the international system that is our own size since Great Britain in the 19th century. So this is really a truly unprecedented situation. And China, I think, to Liz's point, I mean, she knows it better than I do, but I mean, you can also infer it deductively. China's interests are to become, my view, hegemonic over Asia, and from that position become globally preeminent. We cannot allow that if we want to live the lives that I think we should want as Americans. Okay, how do we deny that? Well, there's economic piece, there's political, there's informational, et cetera, but the military piece is absolutely core to this. And the reason is that at the end of the day, it's not very popular to say, but as Mao Zedong rightly put it, power ultimately comes out of the barrel of a gun. And what the Chinese, I think, are finding, actually, is in their pursuit of this goal, they are being frustrated in the employment of economic leverage for decisive effect, because what they need to ask of countries like India, like Australia, like Japan, that are proudly nationalistic, actually, patriotic, is the fundamental compromise of their autonomy. And countries will not give that other than if they are, generally speaking, if they are directly forced by the employment of military force. Look at our blockade of Cuba over the last 60 years. A sorry failure, right? So that's the reality that China is going to, I think, is already encountering. That's good news in the sense that it means countries can stand up to BRI and these kinds of things. The bad news is it makes the military instrument much more attractive for China, and they have an incredibly formidable military instrument. Liz mentioned the PLA. It is mind-bogglingly significant. And I mean, just the hypersonic tests and the dramatic increase in their nuclear forces, which, by the way, I would stress the Chinese for years emphasized that their restraint in their nuclear forces was evidence of their geopolitical restraint, which they are now blowing through with a kind of abandon. So they have a military to do this, and they will be able to project power not only against their near neighbors like Taiwan, but they are building what's called a power projection military. Aircraft carriers, marine forces, space architecture, long-range submarines. That's the military we have, and you build it for a particular reason, which is to impose your will on people that are farther away from you. That's what they're building. So how do we deal with this? The fundamental way to deny China its regional hegemony over the world's most important region is through an anti-hegemonic coalition. Okay, that sounds good. It's kind of happening with things like the Quad and AUKUS and so forth. So far, so good. However, China has the ability to go after that and try to collapse that coalition, not by precipitating a Hitler-like large-scale war, but by picking apart a few of the vulnerable countries within that coalition and essentially causing a run on the bank, which is a very real prospect because, as a lot of countries in Asia are wondering, yes, I would like to stand up to China, but is it prudent? I will be subjected to China's intense ire and great power if I'm imprudent. And so that's a very real concern. And this is a dynamic in politics, international politics. Lee Kuan Yew had a cutting remark about the ties. He said that they bend before the wind blows. But I think that's actually fair to say about a lot of countries in Asia. And they're not crazy to think about it. The Philippines, for instance, is thinking about it. South Korea, in some sense, think about it. So what do we need to do? In this context, we need to deny, this is the second meaning of the word deny China its ability to use its military to coerce countries within that coalition, particularly ones that are connected to us for reasons I can get into, and subordinate them essentially out of that coalition and either into neutrality, a kind of Finlandized neutrality, or into their own coalition. And that is a specific goal. It's a relative goal. It's a low goal, actually. It's not dominance. It's not regime change. It's not dismembering China. It's not humiliating China. But it's saying, I'm going to deny China's ability to subordinate those countries. And basically what that means is if we can deny their ability to invade and impose their will, think Iraq 2003, think China invading Taiwan in order to impose its will, or eventually the Philippines, which it will absolutely have the capacity to do within this decade, certainly by early in the next decade. If we can deny that ability, then China will face a very difficult situation and actually won't have a good military option. The problem is this is feasible. It can be done. We're really good at it, but we're not doing it. And so what we're doing right now is we're not even sleepwalking. We're walking fully awake into disaster. And this is what I find absolutely infuriating, is that we could actually do this within the existing defense budget. We've got to buy the right missiles, the right platforms. We've got to put them in the right places, but we're not doing it. And now I'm getting to the point where I'm thinking to myself, why wouldn't China go after Taiwan? And because Taiwan is critical for a couple of reasons. One is it's the irredentist claims that Liz mentioned about the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. I mean, let it not be said that we haven't been warned. I mean, let it not be said. Xi Jinping has made it abundantly clear. The great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation is his number one priority, and he's explicitly linked the resolution of the Taiwan issue to that great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. In addition, subordinating Taiwan would humiliate the United States, which would make them feel good, but also, more importantly, would undermine the steel in the spine of the anti-hegemonic coalition. So in this decade, I think a war is very possible. And what we need to do right now is stop doing everything else, essentially, and focus on making sure they can't get away with that. If we can do that, I think we will deter them and we will maintain a cold peace.
Very sobering, and I do want to come back to Taiwan very briefly. I'm going to ask panelists to make their comments fairly short because I want to give the audience a chance to ask you questions, but I do want to sort of go from global dominance to global leadership and go back to Tom with a question. In your book, you talk about the rise of nationalist governments as a factor in the failure of global cooperation around a pandemic response, and you make a compelling case for why the United States failed to supply global leadership. But given the world that you describe of power competing, sort of zero-sum minded nationalist states, would the other powers have followed? I mean, there is a real challenge of global leadership here. I wondered what your thoughts are on that topic.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a mixed picture. I think it's important to sort of say that there were elements that actually worked reasonably well. There were elements that didn't work well. So one element that actually surprisingly worked well was on the central bank response, right? Where we talked to a lot of central bank officials, and they had this phrase they used that there was correlation without coordination, right? So each actor did the right thing, it sort of reinforced everyone else, but they weren't really talking to each other in the way that they were talking in 2008, 2009. Vaccine development is another one where there was a lot of unilateral efforts on that, and they actually sort of worked, right? And they arguably worked maybe better than if you did the vaccine development multilaterally. So there were certain things I think that did work, but for the most part, there was just a total lack of coordination and cooperation. And part of that, I think, was, that governments were scared and were frightened, were looking inward, and were trying to sort of tend to their own domestic populations in the best way that they could. And even a country like Germany, did that, and no one would accuse Angela Merkel, of being a nationalist, populist leader. But I think the part of the nationalist and populist element comes in is that we also had, of course, the Bolsonaros of the world, Trump, Modi to some extent, and some others who, I think didn't, and particularly in the US, I think while I agreed with a lot of what they did in terms of the pushing back against China, they did sort of view the pandemic solely through the prism of China. And so when you look at the WHO or something, it was all about, attributing blame to China, whereas most other countries felt there's time to do that later on, right? We actually need to focus on the pandemic sort of response piece. And I think that's where it sort of, broke down. But there's no doubt, I think, that even if you had very sort of multilateralist, cooperative, inclined leaders, it still would have been extraordinarily difficult, right? Because this was just a very difficult crisis that I think set everyone off balance.
Thank you. Yes. Well, maybe a question sort of to test the proposition that China is a strategic actor, Liz. I mean, when you look at China's pandemic response and evaluate it, what does it tell you about China's capacity for strategy? This is sort of the old, is China muddling through question for the China experts.
Yeah, I mean, I think it tells us a lot about the Xi Jinping China. I don't want to actually make the broad claim, that it tells us everything we need to know about China. But I think, look, it demonstrates in the first instance Chinese capacity to mobilize, right? And that is a very traditional attribute of the Communist Party dating back to the 1950s, right? That you have a Leninist system that is very able to, at the top when they really want something done, to mobilize down through the ranks and to arrest the spread of the virus, more effectively than any other major economy. I mean, many other smaller nations like Taiwan, like Greece, like Australia initially, did a very good job also. But for a country of 1.4 billion people, they did an extraordinary job of arresting the spread of the virus. So that's the good news story, and the one that they continue to hold on to and sort of trumpet at home, certainly. I think what it also showed us, though, was, yes, that all of the governance flaws that we understand in China also sort of, came into full bloom during the pandemic. So the lack of transparency, the fact that they went after people who, criticized the government response or who were concerned about Dr. Li Wenliang, the, whistleblower. So, they allowed, it was a little bit Maoist, and you'll appreciate this, Carla. Carla is actually one of the country's, top China scholars. She doesn't get enough of an introduction in this panel, but she really is. So, but it reminded me, of when they let 100 flowers bloom, right? And then Mao did that, and then he went after all of the people who offered their intellectual dissent. It's exactly what happened. The people on the internet, they had that period of freedom, and the people were calling for free speech on the internet. It was pretty extraordinary, and I think an important reminder to all of us. Something we were talking about before the panel is just, even though we can't see dissent in China, even though we don't see the kind of protests that we saw pre-Xi Jinping, it doesn't mean that it's not there, right? It doesn't mean that everybody is 100% behind the way that Xi Jinping is leading this country. So anyway, but then he went after, right, and arrested those people got arrested. I mean, there's a real estate billionaire, Ren Zhiqiang, who said that, Xi Jinping was like an emperor with no clothes. He's 68 years old, right, billionaire, thought he was completely protected. He's in jail for 18 years now for that comment. So we see, we saw that kind of behavior, of course, with the wolf warrior diplomacy, right? And then that leverage thing, right? Threatening to cut off the personal protective equipment, the PPE, if countries didn't thank China enough, or, the sort of, in the midst of it saying to Germany, we're gonna stop buying your cars if you don't put Huawei in, because this was kind of playing out too, Huawei in for your 5G. It's just like this kind of very unattractive, behavior, the disinformation. So everything that China did at home, it was doing on the global stage. And I think that's maybe another lesson that I've taken away from a lot of my work on China over the years, is that there really is no difference between the way that China behaves at home and the way that it behaves abroad, right? So even if you think of something like the Belt and Road Initiative, it is exactly what China did, right? It's rapid infrastructure, debt-led investment, right, that developed the country, with all of the attendant externalities, environmental degradation, bad labor practices, poor governance in terms of the deal making at the outset. So I think what we saw during the pandemic was China's domestic governance, basically playing out on the global stage. And even with the vaccine diplomacy, right, it was about China's narrow self-interest, right? A lot of it was about selling the vaccines, as it turns out, as opposed to donating them, as they promised. So when I look at its behavior, I think, is an impressive display up front. But as the pandemic proceeded, it proved that it wasn't ready to step up to lead in the way that many people anticipated it would, especially given the U.S. withdrawal, right?
Thank you, Liz, and that was very kind of you. Bridge, I want to go back to Taiwan because you make it a centerpiece of your book, and you've written recent op-eds, which I think anticipated some discussion on the Hill in the last couple of days about Beijing's willingness and capability to use force against Taiwan. But what is your evidence? I mean, China has long used this irredentist rhetoric vis-a-vis Taiwan. It could also be trying to intimidate Taiwan into brokering some kind of deal. What's your evidence that it is preparing to use military force?
Well, the best evidence is the development of their military, which, look, I mean, people flap their gums in international politics all the time, but when you really want to look for the best available evidence there is, you can look at the development of military. It's incredibly expensive, it takes a lot of planning, and military forces can be tailored in ways that, do different things. I was at an event last night and somebody asked me, couldn't the Chinese just be stopping at Taiwan, for instance? So indisputably, the Chinese military is focused on Taiwan as their primary planning scenario. But what I said to this gentleman was, in theory, we could live in a world in which the Chinese had solely an anti-access area denial military that was designed solely to defend Chinese territory and maybe resolve the Taiwan issue. But that's not what they're building. You build aircraft carriers for a particular reason. You put satellites in space for military purposes because you want to go and communicate and see things far from your own territory. If you're only concerned about your immediate territory, you use radars and such that are located on your own territory. It's cheaper, it's more reliable, you control it, et cetera. That's not what the Chinese are doing. So the fundamental thing, and I think this is candidly something that the China watcher community doesn't really always appreciate as much, is that there's been a radical shift in the ability of the Chinese to resolve the issue. So but actually the point's even stronger because their intent has been clear. I mean, they would love to have resolved it. In fact, they were getting ready to invade Taiwan in 1950, or 1949, 1950, after the collapse of the Kuomintang on the mainland, and it was only the intervention by the Truman administration when the Korean War broke out that stopped them from being able to do that. So the Chinese had wanted to do it for a long time, they just couldn't do anything about it. And now they absolutely can. And in fact, it's getting to the point where it's become, the Taiwan defense minister said the other day that by the middle, they may be able to do it right now, by the middle of the decade, they might be able to do it easily and at low cost. Which is, is pretty significant. So they want to do it. It's overdetermined. There's irredentist and geopolitical reasons. They have the ability to do it. And then there's also a potential for a window of opportunity. So if you look at the history of why major wars tend to break out, it's often because of a perception of a window of opportunity. It's happened in World War II. I think it happened in World War I, it's fair to say. China sees that our defense establishment is too slowly and fitfully turning to focus on China. Japan is waking up. Taiwan is finally way too slowly waking up. Well, if you wait around, there's going to be more capacity. So if you're China and you have something right now or in the next couple of years, that's a lot of incentive. So, to me, if I look at this deductively, I say, well, and then, by the way, Xinhua put out the other day this tweet or whatever of Xi Jinping and described him as a man of vision and steely determination or something like that. I don't know what it's in Chinese. But it's like, I don't know how they could be more clear. So I think we're being delusional if we don't think, look, we ourselves have started wars in the last 20 years, right? So why would it be beyond the ken for the Chinese to do so over something that they claim is they're willing to start a war? They have a law saying they are prepared to use force. In fact, Xi Jinping said in relation to the Biden summit earlier this week that they're prepared to use force. So, it's sort of like, I'm now thinking like, why wouldn't they? More than why would they?
Thank you. Well, let's hear from the audience. I'm sure these comments have provoked lots of questions.
I was at a virtual conference with the Chinese ambassador to the United States a couple of weeks ago and was just struck by his disdain for the United States and his making no attempt to hide it. It just was palpable. And there are articles out about wolf warrior diplomacy. What's this? Usually a diplomat can, be polite when they call you a jerk. This guy made no effort to be polite, and he called us jerks.
Thanks. Any of you can take that question about China's approach to diplomacy these days.
And to the U.S. in particular.
Yeah, I'll offer one thought, and then Tom and Bridge can weigh in. I think it certainly speaks to it's a new breed of Chinese diplomat. It actually, if you look back, there have been previous Chinese diplomats who, in private, also could be quite unattractive in their diplomacy, but they didn't do it publicly the way that you're saying, Xi Jinping has done. So you could definitely have that same kind of behavior, but it would be in a very small group and privately done. I think, there's an element in China now that says, we are not respected. We are not treated well. You've been criticizing us for our practices, and we're not going to take it anymore. Right? And we're not going to turn the cheek anymore, right? So you slap us, we're going to slap you back. You punch us, we're going to punch you back. And I think that's part of it. And I think the sort of offensive element of it, really does have a lot of popular support. Not among everybody, the people that we will interact with in China in Zoom calls, intellectuals and policy analysts, a lot of them, were saying almost a year ago that wolf warrior diplomacy was over. Right? There was clearly a push by some elements within the foreign ministry and within the academy to have them tamp it down, because they recognize that it's not serving, any real purpose. Right? They had a huge strategic window of opportunity diplomatically during the Trump administration, right? When the U.S. was not, engaged deeply and positively in the international system, and they blew it. Fundamentally, they blew it. With this kind of behavior. So Chinese, the popular public opinion polls globally are at an all-time low. Low trust for Xi Jinping, lowest trust for Xi Jinping, lowest interest in having China lead regionally or globally. And it's a direct result of this wolf warrior diplomacy and the kinds of things that we saw happening during the pandemic. And so you have to wonder, does Xi Jinping realize that when, he makes a statement that the diplomats need to get out there and create an image of a China that is credible, respectable, and loved. It reflects this complete disconnect in understanding between, what makes a country credible, respectable, and loved, right? And it begins with your diplomacy, right, and your actions, neither of which, in many respects, China has, been doing anything to earn those kinds of things. So that's how I understand their wolf warrior diplomacy. It's both it feeds into the nationalism. It is a populist sort of win for Xi Jinping, and there's an element of we're not going to take this anymore.
Tom, do you want to comment on this?
I very much agree with what Liz said. I would just add one, just to go back to the pandemic for a second as an example. It's interesting that when the pandemic hit, and of course Trump was already in a bad place with the Europeans, China had a great opportunity to try to drive a wedge between Europe and the US. If they've been able to position themselves as, we're actually upholding international cooperation here, when the US is not doing so, I'd say there was probably quite a few forces in Europe that would have responded positively to that. But instead, we saw this incredible sort of aggressive wolf warrior diplomacy. And 2020 was the moment where attitudes in Europe really shifted, right? So Europe moved much closer to the US throughout the course of 2020 on China. So the opposite to what what China's opportunity was. And that was largely because of the wolf warrior diplomacy, which I think was felt in a very sort of crude and sort of aggressive way throughout Europe, in countries like France, where you had the Chinese ambassador to France basically blaming the French government for neglecting nursing homes, and lots of very granular criticisms that sort of fell very flat. So I think it is incredibly counterproductive. I think in a way, for those of us who are concerned about what China's doing, it's strategically beneficial, right? Because it's sort of backfiring, and I think it's a big reason why if countries sort of switch and begin to exhibit concern about what China's doing because they see how it affects themselves, That's much more durable and sustainable than if they switch because the President of the United States sort of browbeats them into doing so, right? And what we're seeing because of China's diplomacy, I think, is a more organic, indigenous sort of response to that. But I agree with Bridge and Liz that, the U.S., of course, has to then come in and provide that general leadership, which I do think, is basically happening.
Thank you. Do you want to make a comment?
No, I see there was a number.
No, we have a question over to my left here.
Yes, thank you very much for the talk. You're right, China seems very determined to take over Taiwan. I wonder if some of Xi Jinping's economic advisors said we might want to think about this because we need those semiconductors they make too. And that's not something you can capture militarily. All the time you have to do is blow up the factory, the engineers leave, you got a pile of rubble. And it's not like capturing, say, farmland or something that you can militarily capture. Things like high-tech things you can't really militarily, you can, but you can't really militarily capture that. I don't know if he, and also if he does that, okay, China does have a lot of economic power because they buy a lot of things. They also sell a lot of things to the world. And all those container ships backed up in Long Beach, turn them around and send them back. Oh, we're not paying you for them. So it's a two-way street. He's got to, somebody must be telling him, you got to look at that too. Because he's already got that whole real estate problem he's got going on there. So it's that whole thing.
Yeah.
I wonder, and he does talk, you're right, he's very upfront that we're going to do it. Donald Trump said a lot of stuff too, and never really did it. So I wonder if there's somebody telling him, you got to think about this one a little bit.
Yeah,
thank you.
Well, a couple points. I think President Trump and General Secretary Xi Jinping are very different personalities. So, I think Xi Jinping strikes me as he's been just on this particular point, he's been very consistent and clear, and he's elevated what was already a consistent point for the Chinese Communist Party and the People's Republic. I think the logic of your question is actually something that Liz's colleague in the Biden administration, Kurt Campbell, indicated at the Financial Times that I think is very wrong-headed, which is that the economic consequences of an attack on Taiwan would be sufficient to deter China from pursuing it if it were sufficiently militarily advantageous. And the reason is a couplefold. So specifically on the semiconductor issue, I think China's interests are, if they're going to move militarily, they're going to move very fast and not give a lot of warning. So actually, you can capture, because you capture talent. And if you look at the growth of our missile
Factory and the engineers leave.
Yeah, but, well, are you sure the engineers are going to leave? Right? I've actually asked Taiwans about this. If the Chinese are going to go, they're going to blockade the island and they're going to prevent the people from exiting or coming into the island, and they're going to invade very quickly. And you can bet, absolutely, they know who the important people are. Now, some of them may escape, but if you look at the growth of our space and missile program, that was because we captured people who the Nazis had been using to develop their ballistic missile program. Same with the Soviets.
Ran to us to be captured.
Well, the Soviets actually did capture them, so it's a good point, right? The Soviets actually captured them, so it's also a communist government. Anyway, I don't want to belabor the point on the semiconductors. It's not, the semiconductor issue is kind of a separate, I don't think it's going to be a fundamental driver of China's decision-making. The broader point is that if China sees a military advantage to seizing Taiwan, I don't think the economic warfare argument actually will work or is to our benefit. All those container ships that you're talking about, basically that would require tanking the American economy. Let's talk about it. The president's under intense pressure because the economy's not doing well and inflation is bad and so forth. So we're going to tank the American economy as our response to a Taiwan situation. China's going to say, look, we're not talking about tanking the global economy. We resolve this issue that's part of China. It's a one China principle. You agree with that, which is not true, but that's what they're going to say. And everybody's going to say, why are the Americans tanking the global economy? And Wall Street's going to call up to President Biden and Ron Klain and say, what in God's name are you doing? And so, and by the way, the level of economic pain that would be required to get Xi Jinping to disgorge Taiwan once seized, can you imagine? It doesn't work against Cuba. We haven't been able to get Iran to toe the line. With a unified global, and the Europeans, you can bet, would defect, and even probably some of our Asian partners. So if we don't have a military basis for defending Taiwan, I think an economic counter-blockade is not going to work. Now, that's not to say that the Chinese aren't aware of these risks. So what we have going for us is that the Chinese, I think, need to feel very confident about that the Taiwan situation will be favorably resolved if they move, because the consequences internally, they could end up, Xi Jinping could end up with his head in a noose from the nationalist fervor that would ensue for failure, and also geopolitically, that everyone will now see that China is willing to use military force, but is not dangerous enough to be irresistible. So China has to have very high confidence. That's what we have going for us. But we can't think that we're going to be able to do it by, sending ships back from Long Beach or something like that. It's not going to work.
I'm sure the other speakers have comments on this, but I want to get more questions on the table, so I'm going to turn to my right for a question.
Thank you. Just quickly, you've made a very convincing case for why we should be very afraid, so I got it.
I'm very afraid, so I'm not, I'm very worried, so let me just say, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but I don't want to make you afraid for kicks. I want to make people afraid because I'm afraid just deductively, because I think we can still head off the situation. I think we may save people's lives if we take action that we can take right now to head it off.
And thank you for doing that alarm. We need to hear it. But the question I have is, let's take the opposite look. Could we look at, if you guys were all China experts looking at the U.S., what are their legitimate concerns about our actions, our threats, the fears that they have coming from not only the U.S., but perhaps the West?
That's another great question. And I don't know, why don't I just go down to Tom to start that one off? What are China's great fears?
Oh, well, yeah, I was going to say maybe Liz might start, but just very briefly, I think when you look at what's happened over the last 10 years, and you see this, I think, in Russia and in China, basically, I think it's the fear that liberalism, classical liberalism coming from the West, from the United States, if it succeeds globally, is bad news for their regimes, right? We may think it's good for their countries, but they don't believe it's good for them. And it's the fear of the color revolution. It's the fear of just this persistence of an ideology of democracy, and liberty taking hold in different ways that will undermine their power base. And I think that's what's driven Putin. I think it's what's driven Xi Jinping. I think it's why he's sought to consolidate power so much. Partly it's about getting rid of his domestic competitors, but I think partly it's about trying to insulate China from this global sort of US-led system, where it's really the soft power that's the fundamental threat, right? That is what is seen as most aggressive. That's not to diminish the military power piece, but I think for some of these leaders, the soft power part of it is actually more threatening because it's just always there, right? And it's sort of, the example I would use is, if you look in 2012, when Bloomberg and New York Times revealed the first sort of evidence of corruption within the Chinese system, right? It was quite destabilizing in China. That wasn't a decision President Obama took, right? It wasn't something the US government sat down and said, let's try to undermine China. It just happened because we have a free press and they did their job and there was corruption there and they uncovered things. So it's us being us that is sort of the problem for them, right? And then they be them by sort of doubling down. Then repression ends up at negative externalities for us, whether it's the export of technologies of repression or this global sort of authoritarian access that we're seeing. So I think it is pretty fundamental. In a way, it's a little bit ideological, maybe. I think it comes from deep insecurities on each side, but I think that's what makes this, in addition to what Bridge is saying about just the general balance of power, I think it's that structural element that means we do have a competition of governance systems that I think is likely to be around for some time.
Well, I have a slightly different view. I don't know if you were going to answer, but...
Maybe I'll just offer a little bit of perspective and then... So I think you're right, and the greatest challenge is what's happening right now for China, which is to say you have the United States focused on trying to strengthen itself at home, maintaining many of the Trump administration's sort of tough policies with regard to trade and investment, and in some cases ramping them up, and this is the kicker, actually working to bolster our alliances. One thing over the past 2 years the Chinese kept saying in Zoom calls that I would be on with them is that we don't have, right? We're not in an ideological, battle. This isn't an ideological battle, right? That was what they were most concerned to avoid, because that meant that we're going to take Europe. We're going to basically have 9 of the world's 10 largest economies, which are all democracies, right, allied against China. And that is what they were most concerned to avoid. So I think to your point, I think you're right. Of course, we need to have the military to back us up. But I think that idea that they're going to be contained and encircled is their greatest fear. Just on the Taiwan point, I think the other aspect of this is that Xi Jinping has not articulated a peaceful path for reunification. So even, I agree with Bridge, actually, 100% in terms of the seriousness with which we need to take Xi Jinping's, discussions of unification. But I think it's important to recognize that if you ask a Chinese scholar or official now, how do you get Taiwan peacefully? There is no response at this point. And the one country, two systems, model, right, governance model that they would talk about with regard to Taiwan is basically over because of what they did in Hong Kong. Now even the KMT in Taiwan can't support, reunification on those grounds. So I just think there's that other element of it. In addition to the buildup of the military, there is no credible path forward that Xi Jinping or any Chinese that I've seen in the past few years has been able to articulate.
Just on, because I have agreed with that point, but I have a different view of the idea. I mean, I think that what you expressed the Biden administration point of view, which is this alliance of democracies, but I don't see that really happening, actually.
Okay, first of all, that's not the Biden point of view, it's my point of view.
I don't know, but it's also,
okay.
so my view,
just to be clear, it's my
the Biden point of view, as
that's
laid out
fair.
in the Munich Security Conference speech and so forth. I just don't think that's what's happening. And actually, ma'am, to your question, I actually think I have a somewhat different view in the sense that it's not, the Chinese aren't wholly insane. I mean, look, the Chinese are, when we don't like a country, basically its views, we tend to call them nationalists. When we like it, we say it's patriotic. They're very patriotic. They're very nationalistic, whatever you want to call about it. What they talk about, they say Mao Zedong stood up, China stood up, right, after the century of humiliation. And it's the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. These are matters of national pride and greatness. So in my view, actually, we can get to a détente position with the Chinese in which they will be respected enough, but they cannot demand to be dominant. And that's the thing that I think we will need to change. That doesn't involve their change of the system. I hope the Chinese people live under a better form of government, although I think even if they did change, we would still have problems with them in the way that Russia, we still have problems even though the Soviet Union collapsed. But I do think it is important, ma'am, you put your finger on a point, which is that there are equities that the Chinese are demanding, and in a sense they are due, which is their power is so enormous, and they have produced that through their own hard work and by taking advantage of us in a lot of ways. But that was our fault, as President Trump used to put it. But I think, we do need to be conscious that there is a give. And we can't give too much, but we also can't, I don't believe that this is an existential cage match over ideology where only one of us will survive, because we both have nuclear weapons, we're both massive economies, and that's not a place I want to go. I'm not saying that Tom wants to go there, but I'm just saying it's a different take, and that I think is more what the debate about ideology is really about. It's not that China's ideology doesn't matter, of course it does. They look at things through an ideological prism, certainly the party does, but it's about what are the fundamental stakes here for us in particular, and how do we rack and stack those, and that's fundamentally not ideological.
Thanks. I do want to, I think we should just take the final two questions here from the two people. Sorry, now there's somebody else. We don't have any time left, but I do want to get some questions on the table, and you've been very patient.
Well, very quickly then, anybody can answer this, but particularly I'm interested in Bridges' comments. You've hardly been a ray of sunshine here talking about the possibility of
you got a heart problem, China. You got to deal with it. I'm being honest.
I tend to agree with you quite a bit. And quite frankly, maybe you've thrown some light on that subject. We can talk about containment and all the rest of that all we want to, but if we do get into a war, it seems to me it's not going to just be China, Taiwan, and the U.S. These things have a way of dragging in all manner of countries that are in the neighborhood. One of those is an unstable nuclear power that has been of use to the Chinese for years to tweak, the U.S. But in a situation like that, what can we possibly expect? How can the Chinese contain North Korea? How is that going to exacerbate the situation?
It's a great question. I want to get another question on the table as well, just in case we are able to address that too.
Yeah, I'm curious about the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I was shocked. If you're concerned about the rise of China, how could you not support that? And if something like that is not the way to go, is there some other alliance that you do see as perhaps emerging that could be a good one, like the Quad, with India, Japan, Australia?
Thank you very much. All right, why don't we go through those? I think the question was for you.
No, it's an excellent question, sir. I mean, North Korea, it's definitely a free radical. It's not our priority. One thing to remember about the North Koreans is that they are not purely just a cat's paw of Beijing. I mean, remember in the Cold War, they were much more closely aligned to Moscow than they were to Beijing. And I actually think, again, if you look at North Korea's own narrative of Juche and self-reliance, I don't think they do want to just be purely an instrument or an appendage of China. Now, they have an alliance, but it's fraught. Liz and Carla would know more about it than I. But I think that's, so actually, you know, I think that we want to think creatively about North Korea. It's a loathsome government, unquestionably, but we don't want a situation in which we face a simultaneous conflict, if at all possible. Now, from a military point of view, I think our basic is that the South Koreans should handle the conventional assault from North Korea largely on their own. The U.S., because of the growing threat from the PLA to South Korea, U.S. forces relevant to the peninsula should be focused on China, and increasingly South Korea will need to be as well. And they may need to increase their defense spending as a function of that. But actually, this is I think you put your finger on a really good point, which is that you know, there's a lot of external factors. I mean, I think you may appreciate the book because I try to wrestle with some of how these other actors. I think it's worth saying, in a Taiwan scenario, the only ones that would really matter are the United States, Taiwan, and to possibly a limited extent Japan. Australia might make some contributions, but other than that, nobody really matters. But if a war were to expand, or if the Chinese were to elect to expand a war at the beginning, which is possible, because they may have already assessed that we're going to come in, which actually may be the case, then the war will become a larger thing. But most countries in Asia, it's going to make the most sense for us to have them focus on self-defense, and it's really going to be us, the Japanese to some extent, and narrowly the Australians who are focused on collective defense.
Thank you, thank you. Yes, let's talk about TPP. And I remember Kurt Campbell commenting that if the U.S. didn't join TPP, basically the pivot strategy would get a failing grade. We failed, I guess, by his scoring. I wonder, and we have other countries around the world, not just China, interested in joining the CPTPP, of course Taiwan, but also Great Britain. So curious about how you see sort of the world without the U.S. in a TPP in Asia, or what we might be able to do to maybe push back against China's likely accession.
Yeah. So one quick point, more than North Korea, actually what I wonder about is whether Russia might do some things, you know, even in its own neighborhood to distract and cause problems, forcing our attention to be divided. That's just my own thought on that issue. In terms of U.S. regional economic leadership, I think it is, I don't know where the person who asked the question went. Oh, there you are, I thought you were there. I think it's a really important issue because it is the one element of U.S. regional strategy that has been missing. And you know, many countries in the region say U.S. is the security partner of choice and China is the economic partner of choice. Although, like I said, Japan really gives them a run for their money. I think the good news is that actually Secretary Raimondo is in Asia right now, advancing a new initiative, Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. And it's about rules and standard setting, and it's beginning with a set of countries like Australia and New Zealand and some others, and it's going to expand. And so I think this is going to be an important part of the U.S. Asia strategy moving forward. I think you'll also see that, in discussions of the CPTPP, it's never, right? It's not now. It can't be maybe the way it is right now, but would there be some modifications in the future that may enable, U.S. accession to something like CPTPP? I think that door is still open. And I think if you talk to members in Congress, there's an enormous appetite among many members for the U.S. to reassert itself in the sort of trade realm in Asia. So I think in the first instance we have a really new and pretty exciting initiative coming out, and I wouldn't for this administration or the next administration, I don't think the days of CPTPP are necessarily over. Right.
Thank you, Liz. Tom, I want to give you a chance to maybe share some positive thoughts about the way to manage the riptide of geopolitics and transnational threats. And to wrap us up here.
Right at the end, optimism in 30 seconds or less. Yeah, I guess maybe this is a little bit of a point of disagreement with Bridge, but I think it's important as we look at the China challenge also to have not to lose sight of the other challenges as well, I think, and to have sort of to package it in a affirmative vision for the world, right? And so to offer, and I think that's where, the Europe piece comes in. I don't think everything should be about China everywhere all the time. I think actually that's how we sort of lose, key partners. I think we need to engage, in Europe with an affirmative vision for Europe, right? In Latin America, Africa, similarly, on their own terms. And I think one of the mistakes of the Cold War was to sort of see everything through the same prism, and I think we need not to sort of repeat that mistake here. So I think we will see, hopefully, not a liberal international order. I don't think that sort of really is the way things sort of work anymore, but I think we do need to embrace some of those real challenges Liz was talking about sort of what is the trade agenda in the current sort of environment that we're in, what's that sort of resilience economic agenda, sort of a more managed approach to globalization. And then I think the values and norms piece are a very important element also. But, I actually would be optimistic. I do think when you balance all of that up, I do think the U.S. is in a very strong position if, it can basically articulate sort of a coherent strategy given all of the issues at home.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Let's give our experts a round of applause. Thank you so much.